Hello and good morning. Welcome to the first fall event at the American Enterprise Institute. It's sort of back to school day here at AEI. And I'm delighted to be hosting this panel discussion along with my fellow Brian Miller. And today we'll be considering from the perspective of people who are working to raise capital to either run a biotechnology company or to choose which biotech companies to be placing their investments in, how the current political environment in the United States is affecting their ability to raise capital and how they deploy capital. Specifically, we're going to consider the Inflation Reduction Act and how the price controls and other provisions of that law affect their decisions on how to invest or their ability to raise capital. And we'll also discuss other topics that have sort of emerged and are elevated in discussion, such as the potential for foreign reference pricing or most favored nation pricing as well. So these are people who are not policy wonks, except for me and Brian, who are involved in the day-to-day business of managing risk and attracting investors who have plenty of other places to put their money into the can be highly rewarding financially, but also can be a very risky, mostly a business that is filled with failure. And so I'm really excited. I'm going to start off by starting with Julia, asking each one of our panelists to introduce themselves and say why they think I asked them to join this panel today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Julia Owens, and I'm an entrepreneur and executive in the biotech industry. I'm a biochemist by training who moved to the business side about 25 years ago. I've worked at a half a dozen companies over the course of my career in various business and executive leadership functions. I love working at that interface of business and science, where so many of the investment and risk decisions around how drugs move forward happen. I am currently involved either at an executive level or a board of directors level with 4 early stage biotechnology companies. I am also an advisor to 2 venture capital firms, and I sit on the board of directors of Bio.
I'm Brian Miller. I'm a non-resident fellow here at AEI and an associate professor of medicine at Hopkins. My background is that of a former regulator. I was a reviewer at CDER and also worked at the CMS Innovation Center. I should also note that I serve on MedPAC, the congressional advisory body for the Medicare program, and also on the board of trustees for the North Carolina State Health Plan, which is the largest purchaser of healthcare in the state of North Carolina besides the federal government. And my usual disclaimers, my views are my own and not necessarily those of my employers or affiliations.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy Hong. I'm a life science investor based out in San Diego. I am building a new venture capital firm located in San Diego. So we will be investing in firms that are pre-revenue, trying to develop new medicines, trying to attract venture capital dollars to fund clinical trials in patients. So I come from a scientific background as well, did my PhD in immunology and postdoctoral work in cancer biology. And I think Kirsten asked me here today to give some perspective on what early stage investors are thinking about when they decide which companies to try to fund to get clinical trial data on the path to FDA approval. So thanks.
My name is Tess Cameron. I'm a principal at RA Capital Management, and RA Capital is a life sciences investment fund. We are a multi-stage fund, so while we invest in early stage companies, we also invest in late stage companies, companies with commercial products, both companies that are publicly listed as well as private companies. And so working for an investment fund, my and my colleagues' job is to make money for our investors in the biotech market. And our investors are pension funds and other asset managers whose whole purpose is to is really to make money. If we don't make money in biotech, those funds are going to go somewhere else. Those funds are going to go to tech. Those funds are going to go to other sectors. And that is why Kirsten was kind enough to invite me here is to share that perspective as a fund and as an investor how do we focus on making money in biotech, and how do some of these different policy incentives shape our investment strategy?
Thank you so much. I'm Kirsten Axelsen. I'm a non-resident fellow with the American Enterprise Institute. I also have worked for 25 years in and for the biopharmaceutical industry, most currently as a consultant. So, my perspective is that of one who has worked in the biopharma industry. That's how I've made my money. But I would also say being and working inside that industry may also give me a perspective. Give me a perspective and a bias. So I want to make sure I'm very clear about my experience as I go forward to moderate this panel. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a question for Julia. Oh, one other thing, just for housekeeping. This is all live streamed on YouTube, so everything is being recorded. So if you ask a question, just to be aware. So my first question is for Julia. How is the current environment, specifically the policy environment, shaped by the Inflation Reduction Act, affected your ability to attract initial and follow-on capital to build a new biotech company?
Yeah, I think when asking that question, one has to look at not just the policy environment and IRA, but the broader ecosystem in which biotech is operating right now, which is really not pretty. The biotech industry is still living through a very significant recession set on by a bubble that burst after COVID. Lots of money came into the biotech sector 5 years ago, and lots of companies were started and funded, and that all stopped. That party ended 3 or 4 years ago, and that overhang hasn't gone away. There are still more companies laying off people and shutting down right now than are getting started, and so that creates already a pretty tumultuous backstop. Where investors are worried about managing some of their challenging existing investments versus raising new funds and deploying capital into new companies. So already hard time to be raising money as an investor. Then you layer on top of that some of the policy and other geopolitical headwinds, and it's a pretty tough time for brand new early stage companies. As I said, I'm working with 4, and 3 of them are out there trying to raise money right now. And what you used to be able to raise capital, a financing round to run whatever next stage of development in 3 to 6 months, now that's taking 9 to 12. And that leadership time is really having to be spent on just constantly thinking about how every dollar is allocated and how to raise the next funding to keep the programs going so that they don't have to shut things down. Beyond that, I think there's just a lot of uncertainty. There's been so many changes, and that makes executives as well as investors' job in funding and driving early stage companies even harder.
Makes a lot of sense. So more uncertainty in an already risky business makes it harder to raise money.
Yep.
So my next question is for Nancy, and you've spent a number of years deploying capital into early stage companies. Can you describe to us, how does the expectation of a return on investment in the clinical trial or in the early stage company shape your approach when you're selecting which biotechnology opportunities to back, especially as you consider the changing regulatory and pricing environments in the US?
Sure. So as Tess alluded to, any investor, they're thinking about, return on investment, right? So that's basically a simple equation where the potential return is divided by how much you have to spend to get to a critical milestone that might underwrite that exit return outcome. And so if you start thinking about price control and reduce prices, the likelihood of a pharma company paying a certain amount of money for a successful clinical trial program becomes lower, right? And the amount that we might have to spend may actually increase, right? So that ratio then starts dropping. And while we do have a vast number of choices in terms of programs that we're looking at for potential investments, if you start dropping the return on investment numbers, it makes that process much, much longer and much more difficult, right? So especially if you start targeting specific areas, like say a small molecule program, it will just literally drive people away from that program, right? You'll start looking at non-regulated or less regulated areas because you feel like the return potential is higher there. So it's a very simple kind of equation, and it's one that we might not like as investors because it's not a scientific, technical, patient-driven kind of question. Mm-hmm. It's truly about regulation and the simple economics that we're placing bets and we need to go where the highest probabilities are. It's all, you know, risk and reward, and how do we calculate that risk? If it's a smaller potential return, that's a higher risk.
You once explained to me that in addition to very sophisticated models, emotion drives a lot of decisions.
Right, and so that goes back to what Julia was alluding to. Just, we are used to this business being very highly regulated by the FDA, but that's within a certain stated context, right, of the rules. Once you start introducing new rules that we don't really know how they're going to play out, it just gives a chill to the entire sector that we're already experiencing many, many other challenges to. And that chill has led to, I think, increased inability of investors to confidently place bets, right? The emotional aspect of investing, feeling that excitement and like being willing to believe in success, despite kind of, you know, the overriding low odds of success, is a very important factor. And so when you introduce uncertainty, more potential risk feeling, I think we get this kind of defensive crouch that the industry is in, where very, very few new bets are being placed, even though there is dry, you know, powder capital sitting on the sidelines. You're seeing a lot of investors just take a pause and, as Julia said, kind of worry about their existing portfolio instead of driving new science forward.
Well, and just to note that most investors in this space, both of you included, are scientists and are comfortable judging the science and taking a bet. We know that 9 out of 10 of the drugs that go into clinical development are going to fail, and that you're placing bets across multiple different areas, getting scientific conviction on what's going to really change outcomes for patients and what's not. The challenge, I think, is all the other variables that now have to be layered on top of that. So taking on risk is what we all do if you work in the biotech industry. It's the stacking and stacking and stacking of so many other things that have to be taken into account right now.
I want to build on one thing that Nancy said about return and reward, where when you look at the launch of a drug and the profitability of that drug over time, you're usually starting at very negative, actually, numbers, right? Even Novartis has said that, and you know, this is a company of some scale, for a cardiovascular drug to launch that drug, they may not have a return on their commercial investment for about 4 years until they actually break even. And so time is a really important component of what Nancy laid out there in terms of reward, because often your profitability is going to look like this, where it may take a few years to cross that line where you're actually break even and making money by selling a drug. And then indeed, it's often those years right before the drug goes generic that are the most profitable years. And so as we get into policies like the Inflation Reduction Act, where small molecules essentially only have 9 years before government price controls kick in, saying, okay, we're going to go from 13 to 9, that eats into a very significant component of that reward.
Thank you. So Tess, next question is for you. So considering the risk, how are you adapting your investment strategy to mitigate the risks, specifically considering pricing reforms that are either being enacted in the IRA or ones you might anticipate coming in the US in the next several years?
Absolutely. So I think that there's several elements that we have to consider. As we were talking about, a lot of our team is people who have PhDs or MDs. We would love to be able to focus on just probabilities and potential patient and physician demand for drugs, but there's all these other layers that we need to consider. The major ones that we think about are reimbursement and pricing. And the Inflation Reduction Act, in particular, is a very significant component of how we think about the potential reward for a drug. And another factor that kind of plays in that's also related to price controls is most favored nation. And the impact, I'll start with the Inflation Reduction Act, but the impact that the Inflation Reduction Act has on our investments is, unfortunately, what it means is for any investment that would be impacted by the Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially mainly small molecule drugs that are primarily for a Medicare patient population, the net profits discounted for those drugs shrunk significantly after the Inflation Reduction Act. And so unfortunately, what that means for our investment strategy is it means that those drugs just got less interesting compared to drugs that are primarily for a commercial patient population, right? And just to give some examples, a lot of cardiovascular drugs, Alzheimer's drugs, for certain cancers, many of those drugs are Medicare patient population. Something like dermatologic conditions, right, for your skin, or autoimmune conditions. Many of those are more for a commercial patient population. And so where has there been a lot of excitement and a lot of investment over the past couple of years since the IRA? Well, it's been in biologics for immunology conditions, primarily patient population and biologics. Guess what? Those have 13 years instead of 9 years, even for Medicare patient populations before government price controls kick in. So basically, for us to invest in a Medicare, in a small molecule for a Medicare patient population, the price has to, the price for that investment has to be significantly lower after the IRA as a result of these policy changes. And really importantly, it actually makes it really hard for us to seed investments in any small molecule that is for a Medicare patient population. And the reason for that is that when we kind of back out all of these probabilities that we were talking about, where in phase 1, 9 out of 10 drugs failed, well, guess what? Phase 1 is a couple of years away when you're just seeding a company. And even getting from that kind of preclinical discovery or concept to a phase 1, my gosh, there's a lot of stuff that fails even there. And so that math for us, for many of these small molecules for diseases of aging, it simply does not work in seeding companies. And I think that is one of the real challenges and why we've seen a lot less early stage investment in small molecules for diseases of aging as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, and the small molecule drugs are frankly the ones that can be taken orally and conveniently. They're the ones that can go generic more easily. It's pretty easy to make a generic version once patent life expires for a small molecule drug, whereas biologic drugs are more complex and more expensive to make, usually have to be injected or infused, which is more expensive to do, and it's much harder to make biosimilars and have inexpensive generics. So if we want to bring down healthcare costs for our medicines, we want to be incentivizing more small molecule drug discovery. And we now have substantial evidence that the exact opposite is happening. As Tess said, investment in small molecules is dropping substantially because the return on investment doesn't work for investors.
Thank you. So given that all of these people who are attracting capital to form new medicines are saying they think price controls are harmful, Brian, why is there such strong political interest in implementing price controls, either through the IRA or this interest in sort of trying to match our prices to prices in other countries? Why is this so popular?
Not a loaded question at all,
Yeah.
right? So I think politicians are understandably frustrated because what happens is, most people want new drugs, right? Whether it's heart failure, eczema, Alzheimer's. Most people want new drugs. We all get sick at some point, some age. We're all going to the same place at different speeds, maybe on a different track, depending upon which disease we end up with. So most members of Congress want new drugs. The problem is that they hear from constituents, and the constituents are like, this drug cost me thousands of dollars, or I got through step therapy and I got this cool drug and it cost X, right? And so patients are frustrated and members hear that, and then drug pricing is sort of a morass at this point, right? You have ASP plus 6, you have 340B, you have all these layered administrative interventions that functionally have broken over a period of many years. And so then as the member of Congress, you look at this and you say, well, I'm very frustrated. My constituents, my voters are spending lots of money on drugs, and I have this complex system. Why don't I just apply this simple policy, in this case, price regulation, because that'll solve that problem. The problem is that most of the other drug pricing interventions are price regulation in another form, and they have broken. And so you're just applying another layer of price regulation. So we sort of have a couple choices. One is, the small molecule generic market works really well, and some could argue it works actually too well for some manufacturers. We all want new drugs. We all want innovative products. Can we make the biologics market actually more like the small molecule generics market, where once you've had your blockbuster and recouped your investment, the patients can get cheap biologic products? And can we move the political economy of drug pricing and drug development towards promoting product innovation? And then once you've had your product innovation, you end up in what is functionally generic market. So I think what's making a lot of voters upset is a biologic drug that's been on the market for 15, 20 years and still is super expensive for them. It's not that it should be $0, right? Because we live in a capitalist society and things are not free. But to have a dynamic and competitive biologics market in conjunction with a dynamic and competitive small molecule market, and then start to peel back some of these interventions like the IRA, reform 340B, and move towards a market-based system where drugs, when they're new, are expensive, and when they're old, are cheaper commodity products for consumers.
Right. I think that's a great point. I mean, because the developing drugs is a science and it's a new technology, it's very hard for the regulation to kind of keep pace, right? And so we have had this beautiful explosion of advancements in biologics driven by technology and science development. How do we make sure that the market is kind of keeping pace with that? And I think, speaking, as kind of a representative of the industry, we sign up for that idea that we want to have innovation, and we do understand that eventually the price premium on that needs to go away to broaden the access for everybody. So if we could kind of make sure that's still happening for biologics, I think that would be something that we would at least kind of be comfortable with and we've dealt with before, and we would understand that rather than trying to make new regulations that kind of could have unforeseen consequences.
Yeah, I want to build on something that Brian shared. So when Brian is talking about constituents complaining about the price that they have to pay, really importantly, what those constituents are complaining about is they are complaining about their out-of-pocket cost. Out-of-pocket cost, not always related to the drug price, right? Who sets out-of-pocket cost? Out-of-pocket cost is set by the insurer. And so what do we need to effectively lower out-of-pocket cost and make drugs affordable to people? We need insurance reform. We need PBM reform, right? That is a critical part of actually making drugs affordable. And so simply lowering drug prices without having any kind of read through to insurance, that may not impact anyone at all, right? One of the positive things that the Inflation Reduction Act did is it did implement an out-of-pocket cap for Medicare Part D participants at about $2,000, right? And that, that actually does help with access, right? That actually does help with affordability. But simply lowering drug prices sometimes does not help with affordability to the end patient at all.
Thank you so much. So, Julia, I want to put a question to you, and maybe explain to us a little bit when you're developing a company or an early stage preclinical or early clinical, you have a number of choices about how to develop that medicine. Mm-hmm. Population size, adults, children, post-market studies. Can you talk about how the reimbursement environment and policy and regulation might affect how you decide to develop a potential new medicine?
Yeah. Often, especially if you're going through developing a drug that is fundamentally new biology, you want to explore this in multiple different indications in the clinic to see where it works best and where patients can benefit the most. If you're targeting a certain immune cell, that immune cell may be involved in multiple different conditions and you want to go after them. To me, it's super important that we let the science drive that and make sure the right mechanism is in the right drug is getting to the right patient. Unfortunately, what we've created is some contrived systems where you really are incentivized to go after the largest indications right up front. And because you need to maximize that early value before you lose it. That's not always the right way to do drug development. A lot of times it made a lot of sense to go after a very small indication first, make sure the drug works and knows what it's doing, and then move into larger populations. That's happening a lot less now. It's been partially mitigated by a fix to IRA around orphan drug populations. Previously, as many of you may know, as long as you had one orphan drug designation, you were exempted from IRA. But if you had two or more, that went out the window. Or if you went after an orphan drug indication first and then moved into a non-orphan, again, it started from when it first came on the market, so was a moot point. That has been partially fixed. But orphan indications are those that affect less than 200,000 people in this country, which is very small. If there's an indication that impacts 500,000 people, that's irrelevant. And so those populations of patients that are above orphan but aren't huge blockbusters just are getting deprioritized because it doesn't make sense.
I want to build on that. So the thing that's interesting, I don't think people realize what the IRA did, is it's that point about changing incentives for development. So if you look at the drug development model that the Congressional Budget Office uses, it doesn't actually look at post-approval development, which when I was originally told that, I didn't actually believe that, because that was sort of mind-blowing to me as a physician who practices medicine as a former CETA reviewer. And so you're right. So normally, if you look at like PD-1 inhibitors, you get onto the market with a narrow indication, then you do further post-approval studies, and that indication broadens, and before you know it, something like stage 4 metastatic melanoma went from a several-month survival and a virtual death sentence to a chronic disease which you live with for several years.
It's amazing,
and those drugs, that drug class is actually used for a lot of oncology indications. So that post-approval indication development is not a minor thing. That's actually where a lot, and I would say often for many products, the majority of development occurs.
Especially in oncology.
Yeah, especially in oncology, and even for chronic diseases and small molecules treating like hypertension, heart failure, et cetera. And that's what drives a lot of clinical practice. But because the Congressional Budget Office didn't actually measure post-approval development in their drug development model, we passed a law that actually totally upended the drug development model and encouraged, as you said, to front load a large indication and then sort of forget about all the other indications because you have this artificial clock, whether it's 7 years, 20 years, 5 years. We don't know what that right number is. The law arbitrarily set a number.
Absolutely, and some of those indications you mentioned, those clinical trials are large and long.
And expensive.
Cardiovascular outcome trials involve tens of thousands of patients. Oncology trials, you want to look at overall survival. These take years and years, so you're just not going to invest in them once the drug's on the market, and that means we're not better understanding these drugs and what other patient populations could be benefiting.
And as I quantify, so in a typical year, the FDA might approve, round numbers, 40, 50 new drug applications or NDAs. It approves on average over 200 supplemental NDAs for additional indications a year. So 4 to 5 times the development post-market versus pre-market. And the Congressional Budget Office didn't take that into account.
Definitely. And in our conversation part of the panel, we thought really a good way to think about the impact of a policy like the IRA is to look at the patient population that's most affected by the IRA. So for example, you'd want to think about post-market development for diseases that affect the elderly, because that's where we know the real impact is. So I want to shift gears for a second and put my next question to Nancy. Thinking about raising capital and the sources of where the early stage assets are coming from, could you comment a bit about how the US regulatory environment might affect how capital is raised, and even like sort of geographically where you're looking to get the next promising drug candidate, not you specifically necessarily, but where you see sort of the investment community looking to get the next drug candidate, and where the capital is from sort of globally?
Right, right. Well, we can't really ignore China, right? It has really been in the news how many programs have been found now in China. Interestingly, the vast majority seem to be in the biologic space. So, again, it's a simple question of how much you're spending to get to a certain milestone, right? And in China, they've had a sustained interest in both basic science and biotech early stage development, where they've really encouraged innovation in those areas and have built out vast infrastructure, really strong technical capabilities. And then, of course, they have this giant pool of potential talent to direct in those areas. And it's kind of coming to fruition exactly at the time, unfortunately, when we're kind of throttling our efforts. So what we've seen in the news now is many, many investment firms have found programs from China that are biologics-based, going after targets that often aren't quite new. They might be kind of Me Too targets that have been validated through extensive investment in our arenas, but that they can now combine in what we call bispecific, trispecific antibody formats. And they can develop those very quickly, very cheaply. They can run clinical trials extremely efficiently. So how do we compete with that? We can't, and we actually are bringing a lot of those programs to the United States for further development. I think that's a really interesting question of, in the future, how does our country want to be as an innovator? Do we want to be rewarded for that risk that we're taking, right? And how do we, again, expand on that, right? Where we're taking maybe a little bit less risk. Now we know a drug works and we're trying to expand that. Don't we want to promote that, right? So again, all these incentives have to be aligned. And right now we have a capitalist system where we want the financial reward to mirror the risk that we're taking, right? To invest those dollars to get that reward.
Well, and as you said, so many of those are known biologies. So we'll have 100,000 biologics for different autoimmune conditions or obesity drugs, but it's at the expense of some of the novel biology and early science that could really be going after diseases and conditions that aren't being studied clinically.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what Tess was talking about, this timeline issue, that all these changes that we're doing right now, we won't really feel the effects of because it's affecting the pipeline. And that takes a really, really long time to kind of hit the radar, generally speaking. PD-1 was a new novel molecule, right? A new novel target 20 years ago, right? So
yeah, it was quite amusing, I would say, with the Inflation Reduction Act, where we had a number of conversations with policymakers just to talk about what is the impact, and the question that we always got was, but there's still all these phase 3s happening for small molecules. And it's like, well, yes, the phase 3s will still happen because you can just write off all the R&D that happened before. You're just looking at the cost of the phase 3. It's the seeds that don't get planted. And that is where the real harm is, and that is what we won't see, unfortunately. I mean, we're starting to see it now with some
phase 1 and phase 2
some
trials.
Research that we've seen in phase 1 and phase 2 trials, but it takes a while for this to play out into approved drugs, right? That is going to, unfortunately, be at a time when maybe it's a little too late. I think the point that Nancy made around just the clinical trial efficiency that we see coming out of China, it really points to another area of where the U.S. really can use policy reform, I think, to the advantage of the biotech innovation ecosystem, which is in pursuit of more efficient clinical trials. And I know Brian has had, and done a lot of thinking on that. But this is an area where the U.S. really can be in a strong leadership position by enabling clinical trials and, making that something that institutions and, physicians can take on and run. And right now, it's a very cumbersome system that unfortunately does contribute to the time and cost that it takes to develop drugs here.
Yeah, and building on that, I've heard industry talk about clinical trial reform since I was a medical student 20 years ago, but I actually haven't seen it be executed. And industry is smart, right? So industry can partner with its product market regulator, the FDA, and work to figure out how you get clinical trials in a community setting. How do you integrate it into routine clinical care? How do you get information directly from the electronic health record? How can you have patient self-assessments at home and gather data in a home setting? Because requiring someone with cancer, or requiring someone with diabetes or heart failure to drive to a specific study center separate from their medical care, or drive to an academic medical center 120 minutes from their home, for all these routine study visits, is just not a reasonable expectation for patients who have lives and jobs and are sick on top of it. And then the data burden that is put on product developers. I remember when I was a reviewer, I got these Excel spreadsheets, and it had EKGs for every study visit, and there were like 3 EKGs done for every patient at every study visit. And I was sort of like, why are we getting 3 EKGs for every patient at every single study visit in every single trial, right? So there's a lot of stuff where industry and the FDA, in addition to changing how data is assessed, how data are gathered, that industry and the FDA can work together in clinical trial reform and say, are these data even necessary, right? Like, do I need those data to answer the question of safety and efficacy? Mm-hmm. That could massively reduce the cost of trials. And I think that industry has an opportunity now to partner with the FDA to do that.
Yet instead, what industry is doing in a lot of cases is just not doing phase 1 trials in the US at all.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You go and do your trials in Australia. It's faster, it's cheaper, it's quicker, and in fact, there are tax incentives. You go to the UK, you go to Netherlands. So a lot of the innovation is happening in China, and even US companies are going and doing our phase 1 trials outside of the US. We're undermining and losing so much of what has created the biotech innovation ecosystem in this country, and then on top of that, starving it of investment capital.
Yeah, and if we reduce those regulatory burdens and move those jobs back to the US, those trials, those are highly paid jobs. Those are highly skilled jobs. Yeah. And so I think that's something, as we think about how do you promote a dynamic domestic bioeconomy, that's something that we should be focused on.
We should be able to make sure patients are safe, but do quick phase 1 trials and move on. And generally the industry is doing that. It's just outside the US.
Let me ask a question of Tess, and then this will be my last formal question to Tess, and then I'm going to open up to the audience for questions. So you spoke a bit in your opening about investors have various places to put their money. And one of the things that Brian and I have both noted is in the modeling that informs policymakers, the Congressional Budget Office modeling, there's the expectation that if profit is greater than 0, a drug candidate will still be invested in. Is that your experience?
Absolutely not. No. Just because the NPV is greater than 0 does not necessarily mean that it is something that is a good investment. And that is all because of opportunity cost, right? And what is the opportunity cost? Where else could I put my money? And so if you told me, hey, here's a biotech company, and great news, you might get a couple % return a year. Well, guess what? I'm going to invest in treasury bills instead, because that's a heck of a lot less risky than a biotech company, right? And similarly, if you tell me, well, my gosh, you can put your money in NVIDIA and the stock is just going to go to the moon, well, maybe I'll do that instead, right? So it all becomes an opportunity cost question of where can pension funds and some of these other big asset allocators, where can they actually put their money to generate the highest return? And biotech is on a list of here's the sectors where you can put money relative to other sectors. It's risky. It has these macro kind of policy risks on top of just scientific risks. And then it has to stack up relative to all these other sectors. And so it actually, it really isn't this question of just NPV greater than 0. It's a question of NPV and risk return profile relative to other sectors. And that risk part is really, really important, right? So it's not just about absolute return and what does the absolute return look like. It's how does the absolute return relative to the risk that I'm taking compare to all of these other sectors. And that is where biotech is high on the risk segment. For a brief period of time, during the COVID bubble and kind of before the COVID bubble, it was also high on the return segment. It has not been high on the return part of that axis for the past couple of years, and that means that there's actually a lot of money that used to go into biotech funds, as we've been talking about, that is now going into other funds because those asset allocators have decided that perhaps there's places where they can earn a higher return on their investment. And we as investors, when we are allocating capital, we are always thinking about the opportunity cost of that capital relative to other places. And so again, there's a lot of NPV greater than 0 projects that we simply do not do because we have to be focused on the ones that have the highest reward.
And how does that, I think one of the criticisms of that approach is, well, the industry is going to be fine. On average, something like the Inflation Reduction Act maybe reduces the expectation of revenue overall by 1 or 2%. Explain, though, if you could, how that might affect decision-making on different types of drug candidates.
Absolutely, yes. So I think I've seen that analysis that basically says, look, the Inflation Reduction Act, total revenues for the sector are only going to go down a little bit. Well, first, I think that analysis has, perhaps somewhat rosy assumptions about what the government can do with price, right? So a key assumption that everyone has to make about the Inflation Reduction Act is when government price control set in, by how much is the government controlling price? And there is a minimum discount that the government has to negotiate, but there is no floor, right? So, and by the way, if the government says, look, we want to get an 80% discount on this price, and a company goes back and says, no, then guess what? The government can basically put an excise tax on that product and make it extremely unprofitable for the company to continue to commercialize that product. And indeed, a company's only recourse to not paying that excise tax may then be to not participate in Medicare, Medicaid, which I don't think any of us as citizens and potential patients would want. And so, this all kind of comes back to that revenue expectation, and I think the 1 or 2% maybe has perhaps rosy assumptions about what the potential price controls that the government could implement could be. But then we also have to look at, well, that 1 to 2%, that is actually if we were to just look at the drugs that are impacted by the IRA, which are primarily Medicare drugs, small molecule, right? So for elderly patients, that 1 to 2% is actually a much more significant portion of those medicines, right? And so if you're saying, well, look, gee, for this whole, and I think that analysis was also looking at total revenues, right? So that included revenues from drugs that were not yet price controlled. And so when you start looking at these kind of subsegments of drugs and you look at hey, geez, this is my portfolio of like Medicare small molecule drugs, and you're like, gee, wow, not just the revenue, but the actual discounted profits for those drugs just got knocked down by like 30, 40%, how am I going to justify to my shareholders, to my investors, that I should be investing there rather than investing in these other areas where there's going to be a more favorable risk-reward trade-off?
I mean,
so I think importantly, we are in a capitalist society, right? We can't be asking companies, we can't be asking investors to invest in projects that they know on a risk-adjusted basis are likely to lose money, right? That money is going to go elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think getting back to kind of the emotional question too, it's not as if investors can just tweak their portfolios and say, okay, I'll invest 3% less in this area, right? It again is going to completely chill investment in a whole swath of opportunities, right? So I think as much as we'd like to kind of rationally analyze this, a lot of the actual impact is going to be much more emotionally swayed, just completely leaving deserts of innovation.
I think the other thing is who are the investors? And I know that sounds silly given that I'm sitting on stage with people who are actively investing in building companies, but you mentioned pension funds. So many of the investors, the financial capital behind the active investors such as you all are pension funds. So in a sense, in addition to actually driving new product innovation, you're also generating a return for that pension fund. That pension fund might be teachers, firefighters, state employees, a large company, retiree pension fund. And so the perception that biotech innovation is profitable just for the company or just for the investor is not accurate, because it is, but it's mostly generating that return for that pension fund that is investing in that venture capital fund, investing in that hedge fund, which is then going out and funding new product innovation. So in a sense, when we crush new product innovation, you're not just crushing clinical opportunities, scientific development, and obviously highly skilled, highly paid jobs. You're also potentially crushing returns for someone's retirement fund.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So let me first ask questions from in the room. And if anyone who's watching online wants to ask a question, you can email it to Jack.Rowing@aei.org, and I think that's in your online if you need the spelling. So I see a question here. Thank you. And if you don't mind identifying yourself and asking the question.
Is this on? Yes. So my name is Craig Asher. My firm is called Omics Ventures. We're an early stage biotech investment fund. We're invested with RA Capital in 3 different companies. One of which is a very promising small molecule opportunity at this point. But that's not why I'm raising this point. So I've been a supporter of I'm trying to read the name, the National Security Commission of Emerging Biotechnology for some time. I don't know if you're aware of that. The group was formed about 4-ish years ago by several of the companies where I'm invested, Twist Bioscience and Ginkgo Bioworks being 2 of the larger ones. And the reason it was formed was to try to solve a national security problem around the biotech industry, specifically to address the issue of APIs, so pharmaceutical ingredients being manufactured outside the United States and places that potentially could shut off the supply to the United States. Of course, there are a myriad of other issues around national security for biotech that the Commission has addressed. They just presented their final report, a few months ago, and it does appear they are a bipartisan committee. Senator Young from Indiana is one of the co-chairs, Republican, and spoke at the meeting we had a few months ago. But here's the issue. I'm wondering if there's a potential solution to some of this. So the NCSCEB was formed in a situation where there was no hope, at least from what I could tell, Maybe chaos was the case. Like my friends at Twist Bio, we were basically self-regulating ourselves with the folks at Ginkgo Bioworks, trying to figure out how we would prevent nefarious gene segments.
I'd love to get to your, do you mind getting to your question?
Yeah, I'm getting there from being spread.
Okay.
The question at hand is, could we form a similar group with the support of the Congress to actually try to address several of these issues? Brian's pointing out very correctly, this is complicated, this is involucrated, extremely challenging. But we took on at NCSCEB, I'm saying we, I'm only a bit supporter, we took on the issue and tried to find a space.
If it's okay, because I want to save time for questions, I'll go ahead and ask Brian to
fine, so is
that.
there a way that we could actually try to form a group with the support of the government to try to solve some portion of the issue set that you correctly brought up?
Thank you.
I guess I would say it depends upon which issue set, whether it's drug pricing, probably not, because I think that there's a wide range of views. If you're talking about issues like clinical trial reform and onshoring manufacturing, absolutely, right? I think that that should and is a nonpartisan issue, right? We want cheaper manufacturing, we want cheaper development. I think everybody across the political spectrum recognizes that we live in a global economy, but having a lot of that occur in the US, or as much as reasonably possible, is a good thing. So I think that that is something that could probably be addressed. I think that the drug pricing discussion is much harder, given that you have these stacked legislative interventions dating back 30 years and people keep adding more. I think the first thing that we could do with drug pricing is you could start to give exemptions. If you're subject to, say, the IRA, could you be exempt from 340B? If you do value-based contracting, could you have an exemption from the Medicaid drug rebate program? So I think starting to peel back those legislative interventions and pushing us towards a more dynamic market, again, where a new product, there's an expected financial reward, old product, cheap.
Well, I do think that the point of having more domestic manufacturing of pharmaceuticals is a really important one. And to date, there have been some push for that, strong-arming using tariffs. I ultimately think that there need to be some legislative incentives. It is cheaper to manufacture in China. And if we create incentives, we can avoid both the national security risks as well as have localized control of our own drug supply. But that can't happen in just a year or two. These are plants that have to be inspected regularly by the FDA. They have to have very advanced infrastructure. And so we need to have some ongoing incentives if we're going to address that national security risk, which I agree is real, and bring some of the manufacturing from overseas so that it is in the US.
And that could be part of clinical trial reform.
I think those two things would make huge differences. Clinical trial reform and onshoring incentives could really make a big difference in some of the national security risk that does exist around our industry.
I'm going to see if anybody, thank you so much. Does anybody else have a question? Thank you.
Brian Deslitz, Coleman Capital. I was just wondering if you could comment on the extent to which AI is helping to reduce costs and accelerate timelines in the biotech space. And there's lots of hype, but you're close to the action, and maybe you can put ground truth some of the hype around it.
Yeah, I do think that there is going to be another AI bubble, right? That is kind of the trend in investing, is that certain hype areas attract outsized capital bets, and really only some of those things are going to end up panning out, and then you'll have, again, a hangover to deal with. It is true, though, that most biotech companies are incorporating AI as tools to, kind of supplement and hopefully make more efficient their drug discovery projects. Definitely protein design for biologics really has harnessed computing as a way of really making that a robust technology that, you design something on the computer, it actually tends to work the way you intended. So I do think that, some nugget of the promise is real, but we do have to be wary as investors, not to lean too much into the hype, right? Because it's almost this pendulum swing is so predictable, right? I don't know
Yeah,
if
I
you
would
have
just
other thoughts on
reinforce.
that.
I would reinforce that the AI and kind of going beyond AI and just talking about computational methods broadly. Very important tool. Any discovery company worth their salt has incorporated those tools into their into their capability set to really identify and optimize molecules. There's certainly companies that also have introduced that into, some of their clinical, their clinical trials, more from a patient identification, site identification standpoint. But ultimately, you are still looking at a phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, potentially a CVOT, cardiovascular outcomes trial with tens of thousands of patients, potentially, an oncology trial where you need overall survival. Yes, there are certainly things that we can do that can, increase the efficiency and reduce the cost of those. But without pretty dramatic changes, I think that those benefits, I struggle to see a world where those benefits are really going to outweigh, some of the headwinds that we see now from a pricing standpoint that really, do impact the discounted profit of those medicines.
Especially because a lot of those tools have applications in the early stage discovery.
Yes.
And we're not doing as much early stage discovery right now.
Yeah,
That's not where the investment dollars are going. We're, a lot more dollars are going to in-licensing a phase 2 asset from China and completing trials in the US than applying AI tools to identify new biology or new drugs.
I guess
and importantly, I think just, to speak to, because there's cost, right? Cost, time, risk, reward are some of the key factors in determining what an investment, if an investment is attractive. And on the risk standpoint, what we haven't really seen is like, wow, AI can like really increase the probability of success, right? What we're seeing is like, a reduction in some areas in cost. Maybe in the discovery stage, we're seeing, some improvements in time or improvements in the ability to even identify a candidate. But, saying, wow, like I can really increase my, probability of success of going into phase 1. This, my probability of getting this drug approved is going to be that much higher because of AI. We have not yet seen, such an improvement happen.
I guess I would look at it as a phase 2, phase 3 play. So I was gardening over the Labor Day weekend, and I saw this like 57 Chevy convertible drive by, and it was great. But it also probably got about 7 miles per gallon. It has a carburetor, doesn't have fuel injection, doesn't have power steering, right? The guy was very happy. But that's sort of like our clinical trial ecosystem, and that is basically because care delivery is an artisanal craft, right? So I work in a hospital, like everything is manual. It's I can't even not describe how much every process you do in a clinical setting, whether it's a clinical trial or otherwise, is basically dependent upon human labor doing a specific task. So when you ask about AI, I look at it as you're really asking about automation. And so there are thousands of small efficiencies that we can get in a clinical trial setting, to make it more efficient for the patient and the physician and ultimately the product developer, which would drive down costs. That same thing applies on the product review side, where you get an NDA and you're like, okay, here are the 10 analyses that I need to run, and then here are the 3 custom analyses I need to run. A lot of that stuff could be set up to be sort of pre-canned for you, then you review and edit it, and then do custom analyses yourself. So we could increase both the efficiency of product review in addition to increasing the efficiency of care delivery and clinical trials through AI and automation. But again, that's really hard work. That's really meat and potatoes sort of operations work, and industry has to step up to the plate and sort of put a lot of pressure, frankly, on delivery systems to do that, which is not always politically fun in the interest of transparency, and then also come to the FDA, to the various review shops and say, here's the therapeutic area. Can we agree these are the 10 initial analyses that we should have for all the drugs in this space? And here are the types of custom things that you should be thinking about. And so that requires industry to do that work. I think industry can do that work. I guess my question is, does industry want to do that work? Because historically, the answer has been no.
I think I just want to kind of bring it, bring this conversation back to like why this matters, right? And I think why this matters because you've heard some of the kind of clouds over biotech, right? But the reason why it matters and why we're all so passionate about it is because there is so much that is fundamentally exciting and good for patients happening in the biotech sector. I mean, just over this past weekend, there was pretty incredible data that was presented on like triglyceride reduction and the impact that can have on outcomes, pretty serious outcomes for patients. There were some other quite meaningful advances just presented over this past weekend on other cardiovascular medicines for other cardiovascular diseases that can really make us all better off and make our families all that better off. And so the reason that we're talking about this is because of those real benefits that we're seeing come to fruition with medicines that can really change the trajectory of our lifespan and of our health span, and wanting those to happen based on the patient benefit and what can actually be done, rather than have that really be a result of policy distortions that may kind of incentivize one type of medicine over another type of medicine.
Thank you. We have a question from online. I'm going to ask it of Julia. So the question was, if in addition to the Inflation Reduction Act, if we were to see international price referencing, such as most favored nation policies, how would that change the launch trajectory and planning for a company that is developing a new asset and considering launching it globally?
The reality is we already see cases where companies choose not to launch drugs in certain countries outside of the US because the price being paid is not going to be acceptable. And I think that would just aggravate that quite a bit further, because you would know that price is going to have ripple effects back at the largest market. So we will all agree, I think, that the US is spending too much and is subsidizing other countries. But MFN is not going to be a straightforward way to fix that. We do need to have other countries pay more. But the blunt instrument that's been discussed will have huge ripple effect and implications, much like IRA has and we were discussing today. So I think we need to be really careful about well-intentioned efforts to bring down costs, and maybe focus on some simpler things, whether it's streamlining clinical trials or dealing with insurance reform or improving out-of-pocket costs, before we add yet another unpredictable factor that's going to disrupt an already unstable industry. This industry is a crown jewel of our country, and it's under severe threat right now on multiple different fronts. And we need some stability, we need some predictability, so that we can drive capital, and as Tess was saying, take advantage of this amazing breakthroughs in biology and new science right now that creates such opportunities to improve human health.
And building off that from the political economy discussion, we wouldn't even be here if we had interchangeable biologics with an ANDA-like application. So you could have a blockbuster and the company and pension funds could get a massive return from a new innovative drug. And then when it became older, much older, it would become cheaper, much like the small molecule generic market. But because that hasn't happened for 30 years, and I say 30 years because I remember when Enbrel came on the market because my grandmother could bake pie again, right? So there are unmeasured medical benefits of product innovation, which are super important, namely apple pie. But so if the political economy of you have 30 plus years of pressure in the biologic space, and then you end up with things like IRA expansion, and then you look at what the US is paying, and we are paying officially a crap ton compared to what is being paid in other countries. And understandably, that's frustrating. That makes people upset. I think that the goal in the long term is maybe the US pays less and other countries pay more. So rather than this huge imbalance where we are, we meet somewhere closer in the middle. I think the operations of how we get there is not easy. I can't claim to know what the answer is. But I view it as an interesting opportunity to sort of potentially break the, I would call it oppressive, not nice, thinking about the National Institute for Clinical Effectiveness of the UK, to break sort of those toxic HTA centrally controlled mechanisms in European countries which prevent innovation access for patients, right? This is a tool to put pressure on those, in addition to sort of equalizing the burden of drug costs across the world.
So lightning round for all of the panelists in 30 seconds or less, and you can go in whatever order you want. If you could make one change to policy or regulation, and there's no Congress, there's no approval, you're just a benevolent dictator, what would that thing be in 30 seconds or less? Focus on the biopharmaceutical industry and innovation.
Out-of-pocket costs. When someone has cancer and isn't taking their drug because they can't afford their copay, that is not how we should be regulating access to drugs. Patients need their treatments, and we need to change a way so that there aren't prohibitive out-of-pocket costs that are keeping people from taking drugs they need.
Great.
I would say cheap old biologic drugs that are interchangeable with a simple application, which would then decrease the political pressure for all these sort of other interventionist drug pricing policies like the IRA.
I mean, I would like to more closely tie reward and risk, so maybe we could replace PBMs with AI.
And I would also say out-of-pocket costs, and then below that, I would say fix the pill penalty in the Inflation Reduction Act, and have both small molecules and biologics price controlled at that 13-year time point rather than penalizing pills.
Thank you so much. We have the room for a few minutes more. We'll go ahead and wrap up the online session. If you want to speak to any of our panelists, please do. And thank you so much for our first fall event of AEI. Thanks for attending.